Thanks very much for joining us today. My name is David Halprin. I'm privileged to serve as the CEO of Israel Policy Forum. I want to welcome those of you who are joining Israel Policy Forum for the first time today, and of course, welcome back our returning viewers. Before we begin, I want to thank our supporters. Our work, including today's program, can't happen without you. And over the past year, over 10,000 of you have joined our webinars. Many more have turned to our growing podcast, Israel Policy Pod, and many have accessed our online content, including the weekly Koplow column. If Israel Policy Forum has deepened your knowledge of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and has helped you understand the need for a secure Jewish democratic Israel, if you appreciate our values, which elevate the solutions over slogans, policy over politics, focused on real pragmatic ways forward, I urge you to visit israelpolicyforum.org/support to make a gift before year end today. As was mentioned in that video, our work has grown in the past year. Despite the continued limitations of the pandemic, we've continued to produce credible analysis, new policy research for policymakers in Washington, partnered with over 70 organizations all across the country to provide unique educational programming and content. And through our young professional program, IPF Fatigue, we've continued to engage leaders of the next generation and prepared them to provide leadership in their own communities. And in particular, for those of you who may not be familiar with IPF Fatigue, this young professional program, I'm really excited that as part of today's special year-end webinar, we have the chance to recognize the contributions of Alexandra Stabler. Alex, who will be stepping down as the founding chair of IPF Fatigue's Los Angeles chapter soon, and who has been among the participants in our first ever young professional delegation to Israel and the West Bank. But most importantly, she's been among the most critical founders of the IPF Fatigue program, not only serving as an amazing ambassador for the program, but serving to challenge and shape our team's plans as we've developed this really unique program over the past 3 years, both in Los Angeles, her home community, and across the country. So before we begin our discussion today, which we'll begin momentarily, I want to give the floor, or the Zoom room, over to Alex to say a word about her own experience with IPF Fatigue and about Atid in general. And while I do so, I have the opportunity to say thanks to you, Alex, on behalf of all of us at Israel Policy Forum for your engagement and your leadership over the last 3 years. Thanks so much. Off to you.
Thank you so much, David. I'm humbled. It's been my honor, and thank you for those kind words. Hi, everyone. It's great to be here today. My name is Alex Stabler, and as David mentioned, I'm the founding chair of the LA chapter of IPF Fatigue, which is Israel Policy Forum's initiative engaging young professionals across North America. Since its launch just 3 years ago, IPF Fatigue has really become a home to people like me, people who care about their community and want to stay engaged and informed. People who believe that as American Jews, we have a critical role to play in the relationship between the U.S. and Israel. People who believe that there is more that can and should be done to realize a two-state solution that is good for both Israelis and Palestinians. And people who are just frankly sick and tired of not having thoughtful, rational, productive, and inclusive and straightforward conversations about these issues. For me personally, IPF Fatigue came into my life at a time when I was feeling pretty disillusioned about my almost lifelong experience as an Israel advocate. I felt increasingly ostracized in the rooms where conversations about Israel were happening because I wanted to ask the tough questions and I wanted to figure out how I could show up as an advocate in a way that felt authentic to me and to my values. IPF Fatigue not only empowered me to be an effective advocate, but also empowered me to use my voice in ways I frankly did not know were possible. Their approach to building leaders is truly inside out. And the values and lessons I have taken away from my discussions about Israel policy have helped me become a more engaged and productive member of this community in general, and frankly, just a better person overall. One that knows how to listen, how to keep an open mind, and express my beliefs in ways that I hope will keep our community together rather than tear it apart. Those involved in IPF Fatigue, Atidniks, are not monolithic. Some are secular, others observant, some more liberal, others more conservative. But what makes the Atid community and experience so valuable is the honesty with which we engage difficult subjects, the unique diversity of perspectives we bring to the table, and our readiness to engage and lead. Like this past May, when Hamas and Israel were engaged in yet another conflict, IPF Atid held open Zoom rooms, providing space for community and dialogue with countless young professionals sharing their thoughts, frustrations, and hopes during a difficult time. Like this past November, when Atid convened its newest cohort of Charles Bronfman conveners, training emerged leaders with the tools to shape thoughtful and nuanced programs about the Israel-Palestinian conflict and communities. And like this upcoming January, when IPF Atid will once again host a program we call the Big Conversations, tackling some of the most challenging issues facing the future. Even through the pandemic, Atid hosted over 60 programs across North America, engaging thousands of young professionals with the kind of intellectually honest content that we have long been seeking, content that tests our own assumptions, deepens our own knowledge, and challenges us to be more confident and effective leaders. I want to welcome you all to learn more about the important work of IPF Atid. You can contact Israel Policy Forum directly and by visiting israelpolicyforum.com/Atid. I really want to stress, I believe that if IPF Atid had the opportunity to instill the leadership values in me, in many, many more people, that we would have not only a more productive conversation around these issues, but a better world. I now want to turn the webinar over to Israel Policy Forum's board chair, who I'm proud to introduce, Susie Gelman.
Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. And thank you so much to you, Alex, for all of your efforts on behalf of Israel Policy Forum and for really growing IPF Atid, particularly in your home community of Los Angeles. 2021 was an eventful year for Israeli-Palestinian affairs and U.S. Israel relations, a year that brought new leadership in Washington and in Jerusalem, conflict in Gaza, unrest in Jerusalem, a reset in Israel PA relations, record levels of settler violence, and a new Israeli state budget for the eclectic Bennett-Lapid coalition. We are delighted to be joined today by Israel Policy Forum's Policy Director, Michael Koplow, and Policy Advisor, Shira Efron, to reflect on and unpack this year's events, analyze where things stand for the two-state solution, and offer predictions for what to expect in 2022. As always, we welcome your questions. Please type them in the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen. A recording of this broadcast will be published later on our website at www.israelpolicyforum.org/briefings. So with that, Michael and Shira, thanks so much for joining us once again. Michael, let's turn to you first to provide us with some background. Nearly a year ago, a report was published by the Center for New American Security that you co-authored with Tamara Kaufman-Wittes and Ilan Goldenberg that offered policy recommendations for how the incoming Biden administration should approach the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Recount for us the key points of the study, what has been Biden's approach thus far, and how would you assess his performance?
Thanks a lot, Susie. So the CNAS report that I co-authored with Tammy and Ilan had really three main components. The first was intended to be for the short term, addressing pressing issues that were threatening real progress in the Israeli-Palestinian sphere. The second was pursuing medium-term steps to preserve two states. And lastly was a more long-term look at generally reshaping the U.S. role within the context of Israeli-Palestinian diplomacy. And I think that we're still certainly in phase one, which is the short-term issues and really tackling the things that were pressing. And what the report had recommended in terms of the short term was really, first and foremost, a return to the basic principle of a negotiated two-state outcome to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, something that I think was somewhat in doubt following 4 years of Trump administration policy. And within that idea, there were a number of steps that the report called for beyond simply just laying out a return to that policy. And some of them we've seen implemented and some have yet to be implemented. One of the things that the report called for right away was reestablishing a relationship with the Palestinians and resuming humanitarian assistance and economic assistance consistent with Taylor Force, and that's been done. Other moves, such as reopening the U.S. consulate in Jerusalem, have yet to be done, and I think probably more accurate to say, it's as of yet to be determined whether moves like that will happen. Other things such as tackling the Palestinian prisoner and martyr payment system, something that we felt really was pressing to do immediately and in the short term. That has not been done, largely because the Palestinians have not yet done what they need to do on their side to do that. But in terms of setting U.S. policy back on, I think, a more predictable and stable footing, the administration has definitely gone a decent way toward doing that, and part of that also means not simply focusing on the end game, but really doing things in the words of the report to improve freedom, security, and prosperity for Israelis and Palestinians. And we've seen that not only from the U.S. side, we've seen those types of initiatives from the Israeli side as well with the new Israeli government. And so, if I were grading the administration on what's been done so far, I think that progress certainly has been made, but I don't think that we should pretend that we're not in a bit of a challenging environment in that regard, given all the other issues that are on the table for the administration and frankly for the world, from COVID, the three C's that are often spoken about: COVID, China, and climate. And from the fact that the administration just has other priorities even within the region. So there has been some progress made, but I think that there is still a decent ways to go.
Thanks, Michael. Shira, turning to you. This past May, we witnessed a conflict in Gaza yet again, in addition to inter-ethnic violence in Israel's mixed cities, triggered by events in Sheikh Jarrah and unrest in Jerusalem. Where do things currently stand in Gaza? Do you think that efforts to achieve a more long-term Israel-Hamas ceasefire will succeed? And how do you see other arenas within the Israeli-Palestinian conflict affecting Gaza going forward?
Hi, Susie, everyone. It's good to be here. Yeah, it's a reminder that this too happened this year, along with other things. I'll start with Gaza, and then maybe we can take a broader look at the Palestinian arena. Interestingly, and I don't know if you all remember, but during the Operation Gaza and right in the aftermath, Israeli officials, Israeli analysts said, no longer trying to reach understandings with Hamas. We're done with strengthening the terrorist movement. We're gonna strengthen the Palestinian Authority. We will not transfer funds to Hamas. We will condition reconstruction of Gaza in the return of the captive civilians who are being held hostage in Gaza to civilians mentally ill, and the bodies of the soldiers. And in Hebrew it was Mashaya lo yeh. Whatever that was, not going to happen again. And long and behold, the situation in Gaza, I wouldn't say it's better, because it's really hard to speak about better in the context of Gaza. The situation is so terrible there. But in terms of Israeli policy, not only did things return to their pre-operation levels, but actually more goods are going into Gaza than ever before, to the extent that the goods that were monitored before then were even considered dual-use materials, meaning that they could have military applications, like reinforced bars for constructions, are now removed and can go in freely. There are initiatives, high-level initiatives promoted at the highest levels, including with Israeli support, to get more stuff into Gaza. You have over 10,000 Gazan laborers, workers that are in Israel are called merchants, but there are not that many merchants in Gaza total that are entering Israel daily for work in levels we haven't seen before. And there's a focus on understandings, trying to reach political understandings, mostly with encouragement of Egypt. Egypt sees, it did so right in the aftermath of the operation. Egypt is always very involved, but now it is aware that also being helpful in Gaza is an asset in Washington. and it can help Egypt deal with its challenges in the U.S. So in a sense, despite Israeli change in policy, and there is a positive change in policy also toward the PA, what we're seeing in Gaza is de facto an even stronger recognition of Hamas's rule there, work with Hamas, and seeking some political arrangements, which my understanding is Egypt is pushing for a 5-year understandings. I don't think it's wrong, as someone who have lived through the latest operations. You don't want any more wars, but this has a price, because there is a zero-sum game. If you strengthen Hamas, it does hurt your theoretical peace partner, the Palestinian Authority. And one thing that happened before this operation, which we also need to remember, right? There was the Biden administration January, but also I think it was in March, Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas declared elections. And then in April, the elections got canceled. Then the operation started, and the Palestinian Authority, they're responsible enough for undermining their own credibility, in the eyes of their people. But when Israel is seeking understand things with the competing organization that has a totally different raison d'etre than the political understandings and the peaceful way that the PA is promoting, this sends a message. And the Palestinian Authority, I know we've been saying it for so long, right? But it's the weakest that it's ever been. You look at the support in polling, 80% of Palestinians don't find it credible. The security forces have become over-politicized. They were politicized by design, but they're over-politicized. They are failing to act in centers where they're challenged. Economics, we all talk about, and we can get into this, Israel saying we will strengthen the PA and we will mostly, but what the factor they're doing is, in practice, it's mostly economic steps. We like to call these economic steps, but these are not economic steps. There's nothing economic about them. These are fiscal measures to help the Palestinian Authority pay paychecks. And it's like one month, or even a week goes by. So the totality of things, it just seems like more of the same, doubling down on the previous strategy, better approach, not ignoring the PA. The economic steps are important, but in the absence of a bigger strategy and an idea of where Israel wants to go when it comes to the Palestinians, West Bank and Gaza, I just don't see how this turns into something positive.
Okay, despite a mutual commitment to cooperation and strengthening U.S. Israel relations, several points of tension have emerged between the Bennett-Lapid government and the Biden administration, including plans to reopen the U.S. Consulate General in Jerusalem, disagreements over how to handle the Iran nuclear threat, and settlement construction. Michael, how would you characterize U.S.-Israel relations in this moment, and what do you think will pose the greatest challenge in 2022?
U.S.-Israel relations in this moment are certainly good. There's coordination taking place at all levels, but there have for decades there have been disagreements between the United States and Israel over policy. And certainly that's not going to change. The area that is far and away causing the most disagreement now, and I think likely in the future, is unsurprisingly the question of Iran. And I actually think that in some ways it seems as if the disagreement between the US and Israel on Iran is starting to narrow a bit, but it's not going to go away entirely. At the heart of it, of course, is US strategy going forward and US tactics going forward, and to what extent the United States is eager and seeking to re-enter some sort of deal with Iran. And I think that when that eventuality seemed more likely, which was the case when President Biden took office just under a year ago, there was certainly more tension because the type of deal that was being complicated, whether it was going to be a return to the JCPOA or, as is being spoken about now, this notion of less for less, where you ask less of the Iranians than the JCPOA did, and you lift some sanctions, but not all sanctions. Those were both things that the Israeli government was very much against. I think for understandable and obvious reasons. It seems that over time, as the United States has dealt with the Iranians, there's more pessimism in DC, and I think within the administration, about whether the United States is actually going to be able to come to some sort of agreement with Iran, even something like returning to the original JCPOA or a less for less deal. And so now in the past few weeks, for the first time, we have more signaling from the United States that it is contemplating perhaps military action, or perhaps would back military action. We've seen more hawkish language. We've seen very overt displays of U.S. Israel coordination, including Benny Gantz having been here last week, and as of reporting today, Jake Sullivan heading to Israel in a few days. So I think that has done, all that has lessened a bit some of the disagreement between the U.S. and Iran, but that disagreement certainly is still there, and nobody should downplay it. On the issue of things like settlements or settler violence, there the disagreement is wide, but I think the difference there is that there is much more of an incentive from both sides to try to downplay it. From the US perspective, the Biden administration is not interested in getting into a tit for tat, daily argument with the Israeli government over settlement construction. And I think from the Israeli side, there isn't as clear a sense of what they want to do. When it comes to Iran policy, generally the Israelis tend to be hawkish no matter where they are on the spectrum. But you have an eight-party coalition running the Israeli government, where there's wide disagreement about not only two states, but about settlements, about how to tackle settler violence, whether all settlements are bad, whether only outposts are bad, whether to build in places like Iwan, Atarot, and Givat HaMatos. So I think that because Israeli policy there is somewhat scattershot, and there really is no consensus, it makes sort of a wide, big blow up between the U.S. and Israel, and that also less of a possibility. And so we see these arguments around the margins, but it's certainly not driving things to the same extent that disagreement is over Iran policy.
Thanks, Michael. And I just want to remind our audience, although we already have some good questions in the queue, if you would like to ask one, please type it in the Q&A box. We'll get to as many questions as we can, but I have a couple more. Shira, back to you. In November, the Bennett-Lapid government survived its first major test when it passed a state budget for Israel, the first in several years. So with the coalition in a relatively stable position going into 2022, what do you expect to see in Israeli politics? Do you see any potential tensions within the government that could threaten its viability?
Yes, so, the budget is first just a great thing for Israelis, because the Israeli government has been operating without a budget for over 2 years now, which meant it's very difficult to, plan anything, let alone during a pandemic and economic crisis. But also with passing the budget, as you said, this coalition cemented its hold and stability. Frankly, I said it even before the budget passed, there's no incentive for any of the sitting parties in the coalition to break the coalition, even over ideological differences. You need to understand, this is right, it's almost a miracle, this coalition. It's a hodgepodge, ideological hodgepodge, but most parties are very, very, very small, and polling shows that several of them, including Gidon Saar, justice ministers, the sort of one that broke from Likud party, is not going to pass the threshold and is not going to even get into the Knesset if elections were going to happen today. So there's really no reason why any of these sitting heads of parties and their members who are now, they have cabinet positions, would break the coalition, especially when Netanyahu is out there and he is doing well in polls. So as long as the Netanyahu threat is there, there's really no reason. And also, I mean, it's quite a it's very challenging to be an opposition Knesset member in Israel. No one misses those lives. So I think they're finding pretty admirable ways of overcoming their differences. What Michael mentioned, I think it's not about settlements, right? No one, I think, had the illusion that this type of a government with Naftali Bennett, who initiated the first annexation plan, this type of government would not build in settlements. The problem is not just the quantity, right? It's the quality, and those really the flashpoints they won, the Givat Matos, there's the Givat Shaked, it's Almon. Those are really places that they're members of, the merits of Meretz party, labor doesn't want to stomach. So they find different mechanisms for kicking the can down the road, finding excuses to look into environmental effects of such construction, not to make a decision. There was an interesting case with the government meeting over the Golan Heights, and there was within Meret's platform, the Golan Heights is still considered occupied territory, but they've decided to approve everything that the government wanted to approve because it's more like it's not. I think that the stability of the coalition, maintaining it, ensuring Netanyahu is not back, is more important to all members of the coalition than their ideologies, and they all have to succeed.
Let's dive in a little bit more on settlements that you were just talking about, Shira. Back to Michael. Although the plan to build a Haredi neighborhood in the East Jerusalem area of Atarot was halted last week, settlement construction in controversial areas has continued under this government, despite objections from left-wing coalition members and the Biden administration. Michael, what factors have influenced the government's approach to settlements thus far, and has it been meaningfully different from that of the previous government? What capacity do the center, left, and left-wing parties in the government have to curb these developments?
I think the most important aspect is, what Shira just mentioned. With Netanyahu out there and still around, and as Shira pointed out, Likud is as Likud has been for at this point, well over a decade, number one in the polls. Even if you are somebody from Meretz, it simply isn't worth it to you to bring down the government over settlement construction, frankly, no matter where that settlement construction is. And so, what we've seen is different ministries doing different things in different places, depending on who the minister is. And so, for instance, Elkin, who is the housing and construction minister, he has been responsible for some of the settlement announcements. Ayelet Shaked, as interior minister, has been pushing some of the settlement announcements. Some are under the purview of Benny Gantz as defense minister. And it doesn't really seem as if there's a unified strategy. It sort of seems that anybody who wants to pick up the ball and make an announcement and push in an area over which they have jurisdiction does so. And something that we've heard from Israeli officials when the United States picks up the phone and complains is actually referring to that as kind of a reason for why it's difficult to stop this stuff, right? Because what you tend to hear from Israeli officials is, there is no unified policy, but this person did that and that person did this, and we don't really have a way of stopping it. So I think in some ways it's been sort of a free-for-all. Now, obviously, as we saw with what happened with Atarot, where the Israeli government announced that it was going to move ahead to approve plans for a new 9,000 unit neighborhood in Atarot, which is the site of the old, now defunct Jerusalem airport. And then the Biden administration, asked them to stop. And so it was reported that they would. And then a couple of days after, it was reported that the plans were put on hold. The plan somehow got put back on the agenda of the local planning committee, at which point reports are that Secretary Blinken had an unpleasant phone call with Naftali Bennett, and then lo and behold, when the committee met, they decided that there had to be an environmental impact plan filed first, which may take up to a year. That entire episode demonstrates that the U.S. certainly does have leverage, and the Israeli government also can stop things when they want to stop things. I think it really is a question of motivation. Does the U.S. government want to spend all of its time tracking every single settlement announcement and having its interactions with the Israeli government be about every new unit that gets planned or announced? I think the clear answer to that so far is no. The U.S. government doesn't want to do that. And so, what we've seen, and I think what we're going to continue to see, is the U.S. government picking and choosing its spots, and at least privately setting some red lines with the Israeli government about where sort of really no-go areas from U.S. perspective. Whether the Israeli government is going to listen to that or not move forward in certain areas, I think that's another question altogether. And frankly, that'll probably have to do more with Israeli internal domestic politics than it does anything else. But that seems to be the dynamic that's shaping up so far, where it's sort of U.S. neglect until it becomes a real issue, and then the U.S. presses. And as I said, we've seen that pressing the Israeli government on this can indeed at least temporarily halt some projects.
Shira, earlier this fall, Israel Policy Forum released a study that you, Michael, and Evan Gottesman co-authored entitled "The New Normal: Arab-Israeli Normalization and the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict," that assessed to what extent burgeoning relations between Israel and Sunni Arab states could help advance a two-state solution. And of course, we saw the Prime Minister of Israel, Naftali Bennett, go. I guess he was the first Israeli Prime Minister to go on a state visit. He was in the UAE yesterday. And apparently there's a reciprocal invitation. What role do you envision Israel's new regional partners, as well as Jordan and Egypt, playing in the Israeli-Palestinian arena in the upcoming year?
That's a really good question. I think that we should start with what role Jordan and Egypt can have in promoting more stability. I think when we're talking about promoting a two-state solution, at the end of the day, if this is not the goal that the Israeli government is pushing for now, and this is not the goal that the Israeli government is pushing for now, it's going to be very difficult to harness the goodwill and the abilities of Egypt and Jordan to have positive impact. However, they do have a role, and I think there is an opportunity here. The Abraham Accords were a terrific development in the region, but they by no means were designed to lead to a two-state solution, right? They walled off the Palestinians. That was by design. With Egypt and Jordan, because of geography, because the large Palestinian population in Jordan, they have a stake in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in ways that other Arab regional partners, new partners, don't have in this. We are already seeing it playing out. Egypt, which has always been active in stabilizing Gaza, is taking a way more active role than it ever has post the latest operation. It goes to economic measures, actual construction, opening its crossing, but also having a much more public role in trying to promote stability, working with Qatar, not real natural partners on this to stabilize, because Qatar is still the number one financial supporter of mostly paying Hamas salaries, but also other aid to Gaza, to Gaza's population, unlike the big projects that come from other countries. So this is where Egypt is. Jordan also, we've seen Jordan more involved already. I think there could be more, and this depends also on the Israeli government's willingness and where the U.S. can come in. A more open passage between Jordan and the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, with Palestinian police in the crossing, could be something that both Jordan and the Palestinians would appreciate. The latest, you probably, it was a very exciting memorandum of understanding signed between Israel and Jordan on a swap between renewable energies and water. The Palestinians are not part of this deal, but they should be part of the deal. Geography, just look at the West Bank, it's just in between, makes sense to be part of that. The Palestinian Authority needs to be pushed to conduct reforms. It goes back to my previous comment about speaking about fiscal measures. Absent a real reform, economic reform, the Palestinian Authority creates conditions that are conducive to development of a private sector. We will never be able to have a Palestinian state. It's not economic peace. It's just this has to come hand in hand with the political and diplomatic measure, but it has to be part of it. And it's not happening at the moment. And I think that Egypt and Jordan can, along with other countries, if they are able to repair their ties, can try to help with building sort of infrastructure and giving the assurances to the Palestinian Authority that this is on a step toward independence, if you will, and helping with more projects and more economic steps. And I think, as you said before, the new government and its different approach toward both of these countries, it also gives them an opportunity to be more involved. And it's Michael coined this term in that regard, but we've seen this FOMO, right, of Egypt and Jordan that saw what the UAE and Bahrain and Morocco, how they were viewed after normalization. They said, "Wait, hey, we did this decades ago. We were the brave ones to pave the way." So they're seeing more and more benefits of taking a more active role, and I think they will do more this year.
Thank you, Shira. I'm going to turn to audience questions. We have several. So the first one, I think, is back to you, Shira. This is from someone in our audience who asks about why is Israel strengthening Hamas, referring to what you were saying at the beginning about the Gaza conflict. Can you talk about what's in it for Israel to be strengthening Hamas? And as you pointed out in your introductory remarks, at the same time, strengthening Hamas may weaken the Palestinian Authority, the ultimate peace partner, at least at this point. So how do you see it, Shira?
I mean, I don't think there's anyone, in fact, I'm 100% sure there's no one that sits in the Israeli government is saying, oh, let's strengthen the terrorists. Those are the ones that we want to hold land, and a Palestinian population of 2.2 million people. They're going to turn into 3 million by the end of the decade, right on our border. It's not something that they want, but it's just, sort of just more of the same inertia. It's the international community calls Hamas de facto. They're the de facto rulers of the Gaza Strip. There's an understanding they're not going anywhere. And it's the strengthening Hamas is more opting for short-term quiet, but the cost is in long-term. So here, I'll give you an example. And I mean, we've just seen this play over and over again. So it's not something that so the decision to remove those reinforced the bars for reconstruction, those are things that since 2014, 2015 have not entered Gaza without supervision through a monitored mechanism, a great mechanism that the UN developed for construction. And all of a sudden, Israel decides unilaterally in September that those things no longer needs monitoring. Now it's fine. Israel's risk assessments have changed. They don't think those things constitute a security risk for Israel. That's fine. But you look at it, and it's right before the Jewish holidays because you want quiet. And you do this without partnership with the Palestinian Authority, without the Palestinian Authority taking credit for the decision that reinforced bars would flow into Gaza at scale, without this burden of importing them through a cumbersome mechanism. And it's more just like for buying short-term quiet. And as someone who lives here, I really appreciate quiet. You don't want rockets firing on you, but I think it's very difficult to fathom with the long-term consequences. And the hope is that something will happen, that there will be new leadership in the West Bank, that there will be, I don't know what needs to happen, but that there will be a change, and that will allow for different policies. But the fact is that it's just continuing doing the same and the same and the same. It's okay that Israel understands that Hamas is going to remain a meaningful political part of the Palestinian people. I mean, it is. It's not going anywhere. But I don't think there's a sense of walking open-eyed into the implications, the full implications of this policy and what it does long term.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Jonathan Camel, who is the national chair of IPF Atid and a member of the Israel Policy Forum Board. Jonathan asks, what leverage does Egypt and Qatar or other regional actors have over Hamas? And can anything be done to change Hamas's calculus to prevent future wars? I guess Shira or Michael, you want to start with that?
Yeah, I'll start, and then Shira can jump in. Hi, Jonathan. So, Qatar in particular has a decent amount of leverage over Hamas. The system right now, whereby the old system was Qatari suitcases of cash went into Gaza, and Hamas would effectively take them and distribute them and do with them what they wanted. You now have a slightly modified system where they're basically vouchers for needy families that can get the money directly from ATM machines and banks in Gaza. And then as of a couple of weeks ago, there's an agreement whereby Qatar buys Egyptian fuel, sends the fuel to Gaza, where Hamas sells it and then takes the money and distributes the money to pay civil servant salaries for Hamas members. Without the Qataris providing this money, none of it will happen. So it gives the Qataris an enormous role, both in terms of leverage and influence over Hamas, and frankly in determining whether there's going to be violence again, because without those payments, and that's a really integral part of this sort of quiet for quiet that Shira discussed in her previous answer. I think it's reasonable to expect that there will be violence again coming from Gaza. So the Qataris have a big role, and they certainly have influence. The Egyptians have increased their influence and leverage over time as well, particularly as they've been involved in reconstruction in Gaza. So, I think that Hamas certainly seems to be more responsive to both the Qataris and the Egyptians than they have in the past. Also, one other note, the Egyptians effectively control the only way for Hamas leaders in and out of Gaza through the Rafah crossing, since the Israelis, are not going to let them in and out through their crossings on their side. So there's certainly influence and leverage. But just to reinforce something that Shira said, Hamas isn't going anywhere. There is no appetite within Israeli security circles or political circles to go into Gaza, throw Hamas by force and occupy the Gaza Strip. So, yes, Qatar and Egypt have influence and leverage, but it's important to remember that there are only certain ways in which they can use it. And anyone hoping that they're going to use it to dislodge Hamas from Gaza, that's not really a scenario that's possible.
Shira, do you want to add anything?
Not to add, but I think maybe just, it's not so much about Hamas. I just want to put this in context, because I think it is important to say that Israel has enlarged substantially the number of Palestinians coming to work in Israel, not just from Gaza, right? Also from the West Bank. It has done a lot of, sort of steps that could theoretically should make it easier to export from the West Bank. There's also like digital taxation, really technical stuff with the VAT and other things. So it is in context. Those things are happening, and taking place. But without sort of the political part, without the vision, without understanding that this is just only part of it, I think it's difficult. And when you do that, and at the same time, doing so much in Gaza and reaching some sort of a political understanding in Gaza, right? This is where we're striving to, and doing it with an entity that has a hold on territory and sovereignty, whether we like it or not, including on border crossings, which Michael just mentioned. I mean, the PA could only wish to have a border crossing, sovereignty over a border crossing like Hamas has. This is where sort of the comparison is you know, sort of we have to make this comparison, even though I think in Israeli eyes, they're doing way more towards the West Bank and the PA, but the broader context matters.
Switching gears a little bit to, I guess, this side of the ocean when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. This from Nancy Kaplan. In terms of assessing how much or little progress the Biden administration has been able to achieve thus far, what has been the impact of Senate Republicans slow walking the confirmation process on so many of Biden's nominees, including the new U.S. ambassador to Israel, Tom Nides, who was only able to begin working in his job a week or two ago, and other important State Department posts? I'm going to shift that to you, Michael, first, and then Shira, if you have anything to add.
It certainly had a wide, unmistakable impact on foreign policy and national security policy writ large. And it's not good that Tom Nides wasn't able to get to Israel until a couple of weeks ago. You know, there's still some other really important nominees out there that have been held up. Barbara Leaf, who is supposed to be the Assistant Secretary for Near East, still has not been confirmed. Our friend and my co-author on that CNS paper, Tammy Wittes, you know, has been nominated to be the assistant administrator for the Middle East at USAID, and she's awaiting confirmation. So it's certainly impacting things. You know, as I said, I'm not sure that it is impacting Israel-Palestinian policy any more than it's impacting other things around the world. But it's certainly a problem, and you know, one would hope that for many of these positions, particularly for ambassadors, that any senators that have holds on ambassadors and other nominees for unrelated reasons would drop them. You know, I think the fact that Biden nominees are tens of percentage points behind the previous, I think, 3 or 4 presidents in terms of being confirmed at this point in office, you know, almost a year in, really is not a good sign.
And let me just add to that question, Iron Dome funding, which passed resoundingly in the House and is being held up by a Republican Senator Rand Paul, that can't be helping matters either. Can you just touch on that briefly, Michael?
Sure. So the $1 billion in supplemental Iron Dome voting still has not passed the Senate. Senator Rand Paul has been holding it up. So you know, how and when that gets fixed is anybody's guess. I think it. You know, if my colleague Aaron Weinberg, our director of government relations, were on this call, he'd be able to give us all a very technical, detailed answer. That's why he's our director of government relations and I am not. But you know, as far as to my understanding, you know, it's not going to be resolved before the end of the year, and I think it may have to. I think it may have to wait until the next appropriation cycle. So that's, you know, that's not a good development either. And you know, the less politics that people play with in all these areas, I think the better off everyone will be.
Shira, anything you want to add before I turn to the next question?
I mean, not so much on the, you know, the details themselves, but I think the impression, the signal that you get in Israel with these slow confirmations, that with those that are not, you know, policy wonks and follow what's happening internally, you know, in political struggles in the U.S., it just gives the impression that the U.S. doesn't prioritize this region. You don't have people in office here. The U.S. is withdrawing from the Middle East. It doesn't really care about Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And so this is just reinforces this message that they're getting from, a wider thing. And some, sigh a breath of relief, right? You don't have to really deal with a lot of issues until you have an ambassador in place, including, of course, consulate, all these things were there all the time, but it's different when to have people. But on other issues, right, on Iron Dome, for instance, this is also very worrisome. So it's more the signaling, I think, that matters.
I think we have time for about one more audience question, because then I have a final question for both of you before we wrap. So we've got a question here. Hang on, let me pull it up. Howard Schickler asks, there seems to be a lot of conversations between Iran, the Gulf states, and Saudi Arabia. Significance? Shira, I think I'm going to have you take this on first.
Sure. This is, it's a really big development. It's one that's been in the making for quite a few years. I'll just remind everyone that I think close to, not 2 years ago, but a year and a half ago, we've seen assistance planes from the Emirates going to Tehran with COVID supplies, emergency supplies, humanitarian, not so much from the Saudis, but there's always a difference, despite alignment between Israel and those countries on how they view Iran's in the region. Geography plays a difference, populations plays a difference, financial ties play a difference. And these countries have always been, in the past couple of years have been hedging. And I think as it was clear that the U.S. is going to go, or is trying to go back to the JCPOA, to the nuclear agreement with Iran, was clear that it's very significant, because basically these countries have voiced support in returning to an agreement. We see Saudi and Iranian speaking now officially at the officials level, no longer track twos. The Emiratis as well. So it's very significant, because it does give the U.S. the regional support, at least part of the regional support, putting Israel aside, because Israel is really separate from the whole region on that, on the nuclear file. And a framework to how do we engage on the regional entrenchment of Iran and its malign influence through proxies, which really is a concern to these countries, but it's a little bit of a different concern than to Israel. So I think this is a very significant development, and also it's very significant for Israel, because it is not in the same place as these countries.
Michael, if you don't have anything to add, I'm going to ask each of you one more question. I'm going to put you on the spot, because this is almost the end of 2021. So it's time to make New Year's predictions, not just resolutions. So each of you give me one prediction for 2022, and please think outside of the box as broadly as you wish to. And we won't hold you to it, although, well, we might. Okay, so Michael, I'm going to hit you first. Out of the box prediction for 2022. Surprise us, Michael.
All right. So I think that I think that there's a very good chance in 2022 that we see a lot more violence on the Palestinian side, not against Israelis, but Palestinian on Palestinian, as a result of waning Palestinian Authority control in the West Bank. There have been reports now, leaving aside all of the reporting on the Palestinian Authority's fiscal situation and being close to collapse. And you sort of always have to take the predictions of PA collapse with a grain of salt. There are very many now on the ground reports over the last couple of weeks and months about PA actually losing on the ground control in places in the West Bank outside of Ramallah. The PA security forces have withdrawn. There have been reports about active firefights between PA security forces and other Fatah factions. And that's before you even get to the question of Hamas cells in the West Bank. And their ongoing quest to topple Fatah and the Palestinian Authority. And so, this is a prediction that I hope does not come true, but I do worry that 2022 may bring a new level of lawlessness within the West Bank that pits different Palestinian factions against each other, including, as I said, Palestinian factions that are traditionally seen as being on the same side of the ledger within Fatah. And if that happens, it's going to obviously first and foremost be a huge challenge for Palestinians, but it's going to be a real challenge to Israel and to Israelis as well. So that's a prediction I hope does not come to pass, but one that I think we may be facing.
Shira, turning to you, quick prediction for 2022.
The U.S. consulate will reopen in Jerusalem. Just kidding. It's not a very prediction. I think it's actually not going to happen. I think we're going to see, I don't know if I want to say an actual understanding in Gaza, but I think that with Yair-Lapid also launching his plan, he has a vision for what's going to happen with Gaza, and you have Ministry of Foreign Affairs sort of teams working on it, and you have a desire from the IDF and from other parts of the government to have quiet in Gaza. I think we're going to see more development of Gaza and more items going into Gaza, and it's dare say more projects in Gaza going to pre-2014 levels. I would even dare to say pre-2009 levels. So I don't think that's bad in itself, because there are 2.2 million people there, and the humanitarian situation there is definitely a crisis there. But if this happens without doing anything corresponding on the West Bank, that would be a problem. But I think we will probably see more of that this year.
Well, thank you both so much for all of your work for Israel Policy Forum and for your insightful analysis and reports and everything that really are so educational. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. I mean, this is the end of the year when people think about making charitable contributions. And while Israel Policy Forum offers these webinars as a public service, they do require resources. So if you're not already supporting Israel Policy Forum, I hope you will do so today, especially if you have listened to a webinar more than once. So in any event, please go to israelpolicyforum.org/support and make your contribution. The recording of this program will be posted on the briefings page of our website. As always, I encourage you to subscribe to our podcast, Israel Policy Pod, sign up to receive the weekly Koplow column in your email inbox, and visit our website to access recordings of our previous briefings. Please stay tuned for an announcement regarding our next video briefing, which will obviously be taking place in 2022. Until then, we wish you a happy and healthy new year, and we look forward to seeing you next year. Thank you. Take care.